On a golden autumn morning, Jack Holloway wrestled a stubborn screen door while Martha Green waved from across the street with a pie in her hand. The door protested with a familiar creak before giving way, banging lightly against the frame as Jack muttered under his breath. He wiped his hands on his jeans and glanced up just in time to catch Martha's wave. Her silver hair was pinned neatly under a wide-brimmed sun hat, and the pie plate she carried was wrapped in a blue-checked cloth. She crossed the quiet street at an unhurried pace, her shoes scuffing lightly against the pavement dusted with the first fallen leaves. Jack met her halfway, the corners of his mouth lifting into a genuine smile. "Morning, Martha," he said, reaching for the pie. "Welcome back, Jack," she replied, handing it over. Her eyes twinkled, but there was a weight behind them, something that didn't match the cheerful pie-gifting tradition. "Figured you might need something sweet to go with all the fixing up you'll be doing." Jack balanced the pie carefully against his hip. "House is a little rougher than I remembered, but it's still standing." "That's more than I can say for some things," Martha said, her voice dropping just a hair. She glanced over her shoulder toward a freshly painted white sign posted at the end of the block, one Jack hadn't noticed until now. Creston Hollow Residential Community, proudly maintained by HOA standards. He frowned slightly but said nothing. Martha gave his arm a quick pat, as if to smooth over her comment. "Stop by Harold's later," she said. "Coffee's still terrible, but the company's decent." Jack chuckled under his breath and watched her walk back toward her porch, the screen door slapping shut behind her. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood smoke, old newspapers, and the faint bite of mildew in corners long untouched. Jack set the pie down carefully on the kitchen counter, brushing dust from the faded linoleum. Sunlight slanted through the cracked blinds, illuminating tiny motes of dust dancing lazily in the air. He wandered through the rooms, trailing a hand along walls that once held the laughter of Thanksgiving dinners, summer nights filled with porch songs, and quiet winters by the fireplace. Though it creaked and sighed with every step, the house welcomed him home like an old, patient friend. By midday, Jack figured he'd earned himself a break. He dusted off his boots, grabbed a denim jacket off a hook by the door, and headed toward Main Street. The town unfolded around him like a favorite storybook, storefronts decked in fall garlands, pumpkins lined up along sidewalks, the smell of cinnamon and roasted nuts curling from unseen kitchens. Harold's Diner stood proudly on the corner, the windows polished to a stubborn gleam. Jack pushed open the door, setting off a cheerful jingle, and was greeted by the thick, familiar smells of bacon, burnt coffee, and lemon-scented cleaner. Behind the counter, Harold himself looked up from wiping down a row of mugs. His hair had thinned since Jack's boyhood memories, but the same easy grin broke across his face. "Well, look what the wind blew in," Harold said, tossing the rag over his shoulder. Jack grinned, sliding onto a cracked red vinyl stool at the counter. "Still serving the strongest coffee east of the Mississippi?" "Wouldn't dream of changing tradition," Harold said, pouring a dark stream into a heavy ceramic mug and pushing it Jack's way. Jack took a sip and winced affectionately. "Tastes like home." Martha was already settled in her favorite booth by the window, knitting needles clicking steadily. She caught Jack's eye and lifted her mug in silent greeting. "Place looks the same," Jack said to Harold, glancing around. The jukebox in the corner warbled an old Patsy Cline tune. A couple of old-timers nursed their coffees in the back booth, trading stories with the slow rhythm of a town with no rush left in it. "Looks can fool you," Harold said, leaning closer. His voice dropped a notch. "Lots changed." "Lots still changing." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Heard a whisper about the HOA getting serious." "Serious like a heart attack," Harold muttered. "Pamela Crowley's running things now. Got the whole town tied up tighter than a Christmas turkey. New rules every week. Lawn inspections. Fines for mailbox designs. You name it." Martha clicked her needles a little harder. "Folks don't fight back. Just easier to nod and comply. Till now, maybe." Jack took another cautious sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on his tongue. He had returned to Creston Hollow for peace, for memories, for soil that remembered him as much as he remembered it. But something in Harold's tone, in Martha's knitting needles flashing faster, told him peace might be slower coming than he'd thought. He finished his coffee, dropped a crisp $1 on the counter for a tip, and walked back toward his grandfather's house, the pies still waiting on the counter. A sharp glint caught his eye as he passed the mailbox. Something white was tucked neatly inside. Jack frowned and pulled it free, a thick packet tied with patriotic blue and red string. He carried it up the porch steps, broke the string, and thumbed through the first few pages. Each one was a dense maze of regulations, acceptable house colors, approved garden plants, precise measurements for fences and porches. He flipped to another section, fines listed in heavy, angry typeface for non-compliance. Unauthorized exterior decorations, $50. Grass height exceeding 4 inches, $75. Fence height deviating by more than 3 inches, $100. Jack let out a low, disbelieving breath, his fingers tightening around the packet. At the very bottom, printed in smaller font but no less smug, was the phrase, "For the protection and beautification of our community." He leaned against the porch rail, the sunlight warming his back, and flipped through the absurd list of infractions one more time. Jack flips through pages about fence heights and lawn colors, muttering, "This is going to be fun." The hammer rang out in steady beats as Jack built his new fence, until a sharp voice cut through, "That's not up to code." Jack paused mid-swing, the late morning sun warming the back of his neck. He set the hammer down gently on the top rail and turned toward the voice. Across the neat stretch of trimmed grass, framed against a backdrop of gold and crimson maples, stood Pamela Crowley. She was everything Martha and Harold had hinted at, immaculate blouse tucked into pressed slacks, clipboard clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. 2 HOA committee members, a man and a woman whose names Jack didn't know, flanked her awkwardly. Their eyes darted everywhere but at Jack. The smell of cut grass and fresh earth hung heavy in the air. Somewhere down the block, a rake scratched rhythmically against the sidewalk. Curtains twitched in a few windows, silent witnesses positioning themselves to watch the encounter unfold. Jack wiped his palms on his jeans and leaned casually against the unfinished fence. "Morning," he said, voice steady, polite. Pamela did not return the greeting. Instead, she strode forward, heels clicking sharply against the driveway. She lifted her clipboard with a snap and tapped at a sheet secured neatly beneath the clip. "Section 4, subsection B," she said crisply. "All perimeter fencing must adhere to the approved 6-foot maximum. Your structure exceeds the limit by at least 2 inches. Jack tilted his head slightly, as if considering the information like a curious museum-goer pondering an abstract sculpture. 2 inches, he repeated, his tone neutral. Pamela narrowed her eyes. "Yes. And deviations, no matter how small, constitute a violation." Jack nodded slowly. "I see." He let the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable before adding, "Would you mind showing me that in the packet?" Pamela blinked. The committee members shifted uneasily behind her. A light breeze lifted the edge of Pamela's clipboard paper, but she clutched it tighter. "It's in the documentation you received upon moving in," she said. "I skimmed it," Jack admitted easily, his smile almost apologetic. "But I don't recall anything about measuring down to the inch." Pamela's lips pressed into a thin line. "We enforce strict standards here to preserve property values and neighborhood aesthetics." Jack picked up his measuring tape, flicked it open with a soft metallic snick, and measured from the base of the post to the top of the rail. 5 feet, 11.5 inches, he announced, voice mild. Pamela bristled. "It looks taller." Jack shrugged. "Maybe the ground dips a little on your side. Hard to control for the earth shifting under us." A soft laugh escaped from somewhere down the street, quickly stifled. Jack pretended not to hear. Pamela's face flushed a delicate pink. "The visual impact is the problem," she said sharply. "It disrupts the harmony of the street view." Jack rested his forearms casually on the top rail. "I'm building it to last," he said. "A strong fence keeps good neighbors." One of the committee members, a man in a green windbreaker, cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Pamela shot him a quick look that froze any further movement. Jack's gaze remained calm, unhurried. He knew this kind of power play. He'd seen it in boardrooms and backroom land deals during his years away. Different setting, same scent of control thinly veiled as concern. Pamela lifted her clipboard higher, almost like a shield. If the fence is not corrected to specifications within 72 hours, she said, a formal violation report will be filed. You will incur fines and possible further enforcement actions. Jack leaned back slightly, lifting one booted foot to rest against the bottom rail of the fence. The sunlight caught in his hair, highlighting the beginnings of silver at his temples. He looked at Pamela for a long moment, long enough that she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. The sound of a lawnmower sputtering to life somewhere down the block filled the gap between them. A breeze stirred the red and gold leaves at the curb. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and something sweeter, apple pies cooling on window sills, maybe, or pumpkin bread baking in an oven somewhere. Jack smiled slightly and said, "You're welcome to try." A slap of cold wind rattled Jack's mailbox the next morning. Inside, a bright red violation notice fluttered accusingly. Jack paused on the porch steps, coffee mug in one hand, and stared at the glossy paper like it might sprout teeth and bite him. The wind tugged insistently at his jacket as he plucked the notice free, his fingers brushing the damp chill already settling into the early October morning. He unfolded the paper slowly, eyebrows lifting with every absurd line. Infraction, fence too rustic in appearance. Lawn insufficiently manicured to HOA standards. Failure to present plans for exterior improvements prior to commencement. Each accusation was bolder than the last, printed in officious, bold type with small threats of monetary penalties tucked neatly between paragraphs. Jack huffed a dry chuckle and shook his head. Rustic, he muttered, glancing at the clean, sturdy lines of his almost finished fence. Guess heritage lumber isn't harmonious enough for the neighborhood. The sun was just beginning to burn through the morning mist, casting long, sleepy shadows across the lawns. Jack caught movement from the corner of his eye. Martha, bundled in a quilted jacket, standing on her porch pretending to adjust a flower pot. She offered a small wave, and Jack tipped his coffee mug back in silent salute. Sliding the notice into his back pocket, Jack finished his coffee in a few long gulps, grabbed his keys, and made his way toward Harold's diner. Main Street stirred awake around him, pumpkins stacked neatly by the hardware store, hand-lettered signs announcing cider specials at the market, a few bundled-up children dragging backpacks toward the school bus stop. A white-haired man with suspenders and a flat cap swept the sidewalk in front of the barbershop, pausing to nod as Jack passed. The bell above Harold's door jangled as Jack stepped inside, the warmth and scent of frying bacon wrapping around him like an old wool coat. The diner was half full, the booths occupied by familiar faces wrapped around steaming mugs and thick ceramic plates laden with biscuits and gravy. Harold stood behind the counter, his apron already dusted with flour, wielding a spatula like a scepter. "Morning, Jack," Harold said, jerking his chin toward an empty stool at the counter. "Morning," Jack replied, easing onto the stool with a grateful sigh. He slid the violation notice onto the counter between them with 2 fingers. "Seems I'm already racking up honors." Harold raised one shaggy eyebrow and wiped his hands on a towel. He picked up the notice, squinting at it before letting out a low whistle. "Fence too rustic." Harold read aloud, voice dripping with disbelief. "Man builds something by hand, and they slap him for lack of aesthetic compliance." "Welcome home, right?" Jack said, accepting a mug of black coffee with a nod. Across the diner, Martha Green sat with Frank Hensley and Denise Carter, 2 more longtime residents Jack hadn't seen since before he'd left town years ago. Frank, still broad-shouldered despite the years, lifted a calloused hand in greeting. Denise smiled warmly, her auburn hair pulled into a loose bun under a knitted cap. Jack lifted his mug slightly in reply and turned back to Harold. "Anyone else getting these love letters?" Harold grunted. "Whole town's been getting them. Pamela's got half the block tiptoeing around their own gardens." Martha appeared at his elbow like a specter, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd weathered every kind of storm life could throw. She set a plate down in front of Jack, bacon, scrambled eggs, and a pile of golden hash browns, then, almost casually, slid a folded paper under his coffee mug. Jack caught the glint of mischief in her eyes and slipped the paper free with practiced ease. He unfolded it carefully beneath the cover of his hand. The document was old, its edges slightly yellowed, but the print was crisp. Creston Hollow Residential Community, HOA Guidelines, Original Issue, 1998. He skimmed the pages quickly. Only a handful of simple, reasonable regulations, safety codes, noise curfews after 10 o'clock, basic lawn maintenance. Nothing about fence styles, mailbox colors, or pumpkin displays needing approval. Jack's pulse kicked up, not with anger, but with the sharp, clean adrenaline of opportunity. Martha settled into the stool next to him, sipping her coffee like a woman who had all the time in the world. Some of us kept the old ways, she murmured without looking at him. Just in case. Jack nodded once, grateful for her foresight. His mind was already racing, weighing possibilities, mapping the road ahead. Across the diner, Frank and Denise leaned in over their table, whispering quietly, casting glances toward him. The tension wasn't thick yet, not the kind you could slice with a butter knife, but it was there, humming just under the surface. A collective unease, a town full of people waiting for someone, anyone, to say it was okay to push back. Jack leaned back in his chair, studying the old guidelines, a slow grin spreading across his face. Well, that changes things. The next morning, flyers appeared in every mailbox, special emergency HOA meeting, mandatory attendance. Jack plucked the neon pink flyer from his box, chuckling softly under his breath. The ink bled slightly where the morning mist had kissed it, but the bold words were still easy enough to read. Mandatory, Jack thought. Pamela sure was doubling down. Across the street, Martha Green stood beside her mailbox, reading her own copy with thinly veiled amusement. She caught Jack's eye, lifted her eyebrows, and gave a theatrical shrug before stuffing the paper into her pocket. Down the block, Frank Hensley and Denise Carter huddled together, comparing flyers like kids comparing trading cards. Even the Jones boys from the corner house were out, holding their copies and peering at them with exaggerated horror, as if they'd been handed court summons instead of meeting notices. The town wasn't just awake, it was alert. Harold's Diner buzzed like a hive by noon. It was the only building in Creston Hollow big enough, and neutral enough, to host something resembling a public gathering without raising too many hackles. The old cowbell above the door never got a moment's rest as residents streamed inside, shaking off the chill, stamping their boots, hanging their jackets on wall hooks worn smooth by generations of coffee drinkers. The air was thick with the scent of strong black coffee, bacon grease, and cinnamon rolls fresh from Harold's battered oven. Booths filled quickly, chairs scraped against linoleum as Harold himself darted back and forth, refilling mugs with a practiced hand, pretending not to notice the tension building like a thunderhead above the formica tables. Jack claimed a corner booth with Martha, Frank, and Denise squeezed in beside him. Rick Sanders arrived a few minutes later, sliding into a chair with a nod and an easy smile. His sheriff's badge peeked out just enough from under his jacket to send a subtle, silent message: he wasn't here by accident. Pamela Crowley swept in at exactly 12:15, clipboard clutched tight against her chest. She wore a navy suit that looked starched enough to cut glass and a brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. Two of her usual committee members trailed behind her, looking less certain than usual. Pamela cleared her throat sharply. Conversations dwindled to a low murmur. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice pitched a little too high. "Given recent events, it's imperative we reaffirm the standards that maintain Creston Hollow's excellence." Frank muttered something under his breath, and Jack fought the urge to smile. Pamela pressed on. "Certain individuals," her gaze flickered briefly toward Jack, "have exhibited behaviors that threaten the cohesion and appearance of our neighborhood." A few heads turned. Denise crossed her arms tightly across her chest. Martha's knitting needles clicked faster under the table. Pamela launched into a litany of infractions and violations, speaking faster and faster, as if sheer volume could beat back the growing restlessness in the room. Words like community harmony and property value floated above the diners like soap bubbles, thin, pretty, and ready to pop. When she paused for breath, Frank Hensley stood, his big hands braced on the table. His voice was quiet but carried to every corner. "Pamela, he said, "Where's the financial report?" Pamela blinked. "Pardon?" Frank didn't flinch. "The HOA's supposed to present a financial statement every quarter. Last one we saw was nearly 2 years ago." Murmurs rippled through the diner. Martha spoke up next, her voice deceptively mild. "And what about the new landscaping fees? I got billed 4 beautification projects I never approved." Denise leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Same here. $50 for seasonal enhancements, but I never saw any new flowers." Pamela's smile slipped, just a little. Rick sipped his coffee and leaned back in his chair, utterly at ease. He lifted his mug in a small salute to no one in particular. "Course," he drawled, "if there's confusion, county ordinances allow for an independent audit. Just to clear the air." The murmur grew into something more solid, a low, gathering hum of agreement. Pamela's hand tightened on her clipboard. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Harold, from behind the counter, wiped his hands on a towel and spoke up in a tone as casual as ordering pie. "Maybe it's time we think about dissolving this HOA altogether. Start fresh. Neighbors taking care of neighbors, no middlemen needed." For a heartbeat, silence. Then Martha nodded. "Denise. Frank." Others followed, soft affirmations growing louder, gaining confidence. Pamela's face paled. She clutched her clipboard like a drowning woman clutching driftwood. "No," she said, but it came out thin, almost a whisper. A farmer at the counter said, "Why not? Town did fine before all this fuss." Rick set his mug down with a quiet clink. His badge caught the light again, a brief gleam under the muted diner's lamps. Pamela stared around the room, searching for support that wasn't there. The old jukebox crooned a slow Patsy Cline ballad in the background, heartbreak gentle and inevitable. Without warning, Pamela slammed her clipboard down on the counter with a crack that made the cowbell above the door jangle. She stormed out without a word, the diner door banging shut behind her. By the time Saturday's sunrise spilled across Main Street, a "for sale" sign wobbled awkwardly on Pamela Crowley's front lawn. Jack noticed it on his morning walk, coffee in one hand, jacket collar turned up against the crisp bite of late October air. The sign leaned slightly to one side, as if even the earth underneath it couldn't muster much enthusiasm for its new assignment. Word traveled faster than the fall breeze. By the time Jack reached Harold's diner, the town already buzzed with the news. Pamela had packed up and slipped away sometime during the night, no farewell notes, no speeches, not even a last-minute edict about mailbox colors. Just silence, and the clumsy testament of a wobbly sign. Harold's diner was already humming, full of warm chatter and the smells of cinnamon rolls and sizzling bacon. Jack stepped inside to a chorus of easy greetings, the kind of sound that filled a space better than any jukebox. "Morning, Jack," Harold called from behind the counter, paint flecked on his apron. In one hand, he held a wooden sign, the letters still wet and gleaming. "Freedom Fields, EST 2023. Martha, perched on her favorite stool near the window, tapped her coffee mug in salute. Frank and Denise waved from a corner booth, where flyers for the Fall Harvest Festival were strewn across the table like leaves after a strong breeze. Jack couldn't help but smile. There was no gloating in the air, only relief, light as fresh linen snapping on a line. As Jack sipped his coffee, plans for the festival spun out around him: who would man the cider stand, who would run the hayrides, who was baking pies and who was stitching burlap sacks for the kids' races. It was the kind of work that stitched a town back together, one thread at a time. Out on Main Street, the transformation had already begun. Wooden booths lined the sidewalks, half-assembled but full of promise. The smell of fresh sawdust mixed with the spicy sweetness of early pumpkins. Flags and autumn garlands stretched between lampposts. Someone tuned a guitar by the old post office steps, the twang drifting through the crisp air. Jack rolled up his sleeves and spent the better part of the morning hammering together booths with Frank and a few others. Laughter sparked easily between them, rising over the clatter of hammers and the cheerful whir of electric drills. Kids darted around with bundles of corn stalks, sticky with candy already, though the festival hadn't officially begun. Martha managed the pie table with ruthless efficiency, her hands a blur of aluminum foil and plastic wrap. Denise organized the volunteers for the bake sale, corralling teenagers with the same sharpness she once used at the library's reference desk. By late afternoon, Main Street looked ready to host something bigger than a festival. It looked ready to host hope itself. The Fall Harvest Festival opened with little fanfare but much heart. Mason jars filled with cider sweated on every surface. Platters of pumpkin pies and caramel apples disappeared faster than Harold's cinnamon rolls at dawn. Hayrides bumped and jolted down Maple Lane, children shrieking with delight as they clutched each other on the rattling wagons. The old jukebox from Harold's Diner had been wheeled onto the sidewalk and now played a steady rotation of 60s classics, Patsy Cline and Johnny Cash and Sam Cooke, their voices weaving nostalgia through the golden afternoon. As the sun dipped lower, casting the town in a warm, honeyed glow, Frank Hensley climbed up onto the small stage near the center of the festival. He cleared his throat once, then leaned into the microphone with the unpracticed awkwardness of a man more used to tractors than public speaking. "Folks," Frank began, voice rough but steady, "we been through a season, haven't we?" The crowd chuckled softly, the kind of laughter that forgave and remembered all at once. Frank glanced toward Jack, who stood near the front, hands shoved into his pockets, boots scuffing the grass. "Sometimes," Frank continued, "it only takes one rooted soul to save a whole field." The applause started slow but built quickly, a wave of gratitude that lifted and carried across the festival grounds. Jack felt his ears burn slightly but accepted it with a quiet nod, knowing it wasn't really about him, it was about all of them. About standing up. About standing together. Frank hopped down from the stage with a sheepish grin, and Harold stepped forward, holding a plain wooden box. From it, he pulled a handful of sunflower seeds. Jack took the shovel they handed him, the old, splintered handle familiar and worn. He stepped to the patch of fresh-turned soil marked off near the new Freedom Fields sign, and as the children gathered around him, wide-eyed and wriggling with excitement, he pressed the blade into the earth. Jack, smiling, picks up a shovel. The first ceremonial sunflower planting begins as children crowd around. On the crisp morning after the festival, Jack stood beside the freshly mounted Freedom Fields sign, hammer in hand, sunlight glinting off the varnish. The wood still smelled faintly of fresh pine, and the green lettering, bold and welcoming, caught the early light like a promise. Jack adjusted the last bolt, giving it one final satisfying tap before stepping back to admire the work. Across Main Street, storefronts sported cheerful window paintings, sunflowers, laughing children, soaring bluebirds. What had once been stifling HOA notices were now covered with bursts of color and life. Near the old community center, a group of kids knelt with brushes and tempera paint, their little hands leaving messy, happy marks on the once blank wall, a mural of hands joined together, stretching upward toward a wide golden sun. Jack slipped the hammer into his back pocket and walked slowly down the sidewalk, greeting neighbors who waved from porches and open shop doors. The crisp scent of fallen leaves and cinnamon hung thick in the air, stirred by every passing breeze. At Harold's Diner, the old cowbell over the door gave its familiar clatter as Jack stepped inside. The place bustled louder than usual, tables pushed together for bigger groups, laughter bouncing off the windows, pie crumbs scattering like confetti across tabletops. Martha Green sat by the window, a knitting bag at her feet and a cup of coffee steaming in her hands. She looked up and gave Jack a smile that carried years of shared weather and worn front steps between them. Rick Sanders leaned against the counter, his sheriff's jacket slung over a chair, sipping coffee and trading jokes with Harold. Denise and Frank squeezed into a booth with a half-dozen others, passing around platters of bacon and sweet rolls. There was no tension here anymore, no careful glances, no tight shoulders. Just a town exhaling after a long, stubborn breath. Rick caught Jack's eye and tipped his mug. "Thought you might want to hear it from me," Rick said as Jack approached. He set his mug down and leaned casually against the counter. "The town council voted this morning. Creston Hollow's charter's been amended." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Amended?" Rick nodded, his grin slow and proud. "No more rigid HOA nonsense. From now on, it's a good neighbor agreement. Plain language. Simple respect." Martha chimed in from her table. No fines. No arbitrary rules. Just neighbors looking out for each other. A small cheer rose from the room, soft but genuine. The jukebox played something slow and golden in the background, Patsy Cline again, maybe, and the world outside the diner's windows glowed under the mellow, forgiving light of mid-autumn. Later that afternoon, the first official freedom picnic gathered under the sprawling oaks behind the diner. Checkered blankets dotted the grass. Folding tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes, deviled eggs, baked beans, cornbread still warm from the oven. Kids ran barefoot across the lawn, faces sticky with apple pie and lemonade. Jack stood near the center, feeling the hum of the gathering settle into his bones. He cleared his throat, tapping a glass gently with a fork. Conversations quieted, chairs scraped back, heads turned. Jack wasn't one for speeches, but today felt different. He lifted his gaze, sweeping over faces lined by years of work and smiles, the easy slouch of teenagers, the open wonder of small children. "I've been thinking," Jack began, voice steady but thick with feeling, "about how easy it is for roots to turn inward. To tangle up. To choke themselves without meaning to." The crowd listened, a breeze nudging the bunting overhead. "But when roots spread out," Jack continued, "when they reach toward each other instead of away, they grow stronger. Deeper. They build something bigger than any one tree could manage alone." He paused, feeling the weight of the words settle into the earth with him. Roots grow stronger when they spread together, not when they fight each other. The applause was soft at first, then swelled, hands clapping against knees and paper plates and worn denim. It wasn't loud, but it was full of hope, of belonging, of the long, patient work of making something better. As twilight settled over Freedom Fields, Jack leaned against the diner railing, the worn wood solid under his palms. The sunflowers they'd planted the day before swayed gently in the cool evening breeze, their golden faces turned skyward even as the sun slipped away. Jack sipped from a mason jar of sweet tea, the music of laughter and soft guitar strumming drifting through the air like wood smoke. He watched the town move, children chasing fireflies, neighbors swapping recipes, Martha knitting quietly with two small girls leaning over her lap, and he felt it settle inside him, deep and sure. This time, they planted more than seeds. They planted hope.